Hello, everyone. My name is Michelle Monroe, and today I'm going to be discussing the literacy crisis in the US for our Communications 101 class. So, to begin, I'd like for you all to envision a world where you're unable to fully comprehend what's being told to you by not only your peers, but also your government. And unfortunately, this is the reality for many Americans today. 21% of Americans are considered functionally illiterate, and 46% of Americans read below a sixth grade reading level. And basically, what that means is even if you're able to read, you're not able to fully comprehend everything that you're reading. So, why do we have these low literacy rates, and why does it matter? Well, my suspicions as to why we have these low literacy rates include the lack of resources given to educators and students, as well as ineffective policies we've placed, and the effects of the COVID-19 pandemic, which I will touch more on in just a moment. However, the more important, why should we care? Well, this is something that affects each and every one of us, no matter if you're a student, an educator, or someone that has never really thought about this. Literacy isn't so much about reading as it is comprehending what's going on in the world around you. And with that, it brings me to my first point, which is the lack of resources. So, despite the US placing a great deal of value in our education system, teachers and students still are often left behind. And arguably, teachers are one of our most important resources, which brings me to my first visual aid that demonstrates the amount of teacher vacancies per 10,000 students per state. These darker states like Montana and New Mexico are going to have the higher amount of teacher vacancies per 10,000 students versus the lighter states like Utah, Colorado. Those are going to be the states that had the least amount of teacher vacancies. With that in mind, 1 in 8 teacher positions last year was filled by someone that was either underqualified or it was left completely vacant. And if we don't have teachers to teach, or we have underqualified teachers teaching in classrooms that are already overcrowded, already filled with outdated material or lack thereof, where does the burden fall on who is to teach? That often falls on the student, unfortunately, and oftentimes the financial burden will fall on the student. And I'd like to quote the Journal of Human Rights for you all. For citizens to fully participate in a rights-based democracy, they must be explicitly educated to interrogate media messaging and information. And basically, what this is saying is we must be taught to understand. And if we're not taught, then we are unable to understand. So we need the resources, we need educators to teach us. And that brings me to my next point, which is policies that have affected literacy. So, No Child Left Behind, as well as Every Student Succeeds Act, which replaced that, were policies that pivoted teaching towards teaching to test. So it placed a higher value on standardized testing, rewarding areas that had higher test scores with more funding and punishing areas with lower test scores with less funding. But like we discussed before, lack of resources already sets you up for failure. So if you're already in a bad position, what are you going to do? Fall further down into the hole. And as I said before, oftentimes these policies will make the financial burden fall on the students. And this is evident in this next chart that I have here, which demonstrates the SAT scores of students in lower income families and higher income families. So, as we can see, the students that were in lower income families tested lower, and subsequently, the students in higher income families tested much higher. While we're thinking about that, I'd like to quote Fouts and Trollian. Schools with high performing students will receive more, further widening the divide between the haves and the have nots. So, with that, students that have already been struggling continue to struggle. And then you throw in a pandemic in the mix like COVID-19, and it's the recipe for a perfect storm. Which brings me to my last point. During the pandemic, teaching was flipped upside down. Students were forced to stay at home, and teachers had to adapt their teaching styles to teach remotely. However, once schools reopened, instructional styles never really went back to how they were prior to COVID. And this is evident too in the way that students were able to learn information post COVID, which brings me to my next visual aid. As we can see here, students that were ready for kindergarten in 2019 to 2020 were significantly higher than the students that were ready post COVID. And while there has been some improvement, it is nowhere near to where the numbers were before COVID, unfortunately. And on that same note, even in colleges, colleges have moved towards no test systems, which place people into entrance classes. Like if you're a STEM major, you automatically go into Calc 1. So it leaves out people that may need remedial work. And also, they have moved towards a lot of pass or fail classes, which gets rid of the determinability of how well somebody actually did in a class. With that in mind, I would like to quote this journal. There's a difference between a pass seeing a C or a D when you're trying to figure out how well someone did in calculus, and that is so true. Now you guys can see just how much adequate resources, poor policy, and COVID-19 have all impacted the literacy crisis in the US. So, with that, when literacy decreases, comprehension decreases, and so does our ability to navigate in the world that we have. And I'd like to leave you guys with this quote: low literacy is not a reflection of intelligence. Thank you guys so much.